Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. I hope that you had a good holiday and that your new year is off to a good start. I went to Texas for Christmas, so I got to check out a few cool haunted things there. Went to the Old Alton Bridge, aka the Goatman's Bridge, which I'll probably do an episode about sometime in the next few months. I went to a cool haunted bookstore in Denton, Texas called Recycled Books. I found a really cool cemetery near where I grew up, where the graves are marked with crosses made out of PVC pipes, and it's like a really old cemetery from the 19th century. So saw a lot of cool stuff and excited to go on some more paranormal adventures this year. So this time I'm continuing my series on Fordham University. I think this is like the 7th episode in the series, and I think I have notes for 10 episodes, so we're almost there. Though also, if any Fordham students or Fordham grads are listening to this, I would love to hear about any strange experiences that people had at Fordham, and I can be contacted at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. So before I get into this week's episode, one last thing I want to mention, which is it's January in New York City, which means that my radiators are on, which is great because I have heat, but it's not great for recording because they're pretty loud. So I'm in the room with the quietest radiator and the most road noise. So just apologies in advance if you hear the occasional bang in the background and maybe a car going by, though hopefully it's not going to be too bad this time. But you know, it will add to the haunted New York City ambiance. So anyway, this time I wanted to talk about some buildings on Fordham's campus that didn't have enough paranormal stories about them to each get their own episode. But if you're just jumping in on this episode or you've been skipping around throughout the series, quick refresher, Fordham University is a Jesuit college here in New York City. It is in the Bronx, and it is famously haunted. And it is my contention that the Bronx campus of Fordham University is the most haunted half mile in all of New York City. It's a very, very haunted place. And I've done episodes about different buildings on campus, and a couple dorms, 2 that I lived in, had enough material so that I did 2 episodes about them each, Queens Court and Finley Hall. But there are a lot of dorms on campus, and there are some that, have some weird stuff that I wanted to make sure to talk about. The dorms that I'm going to talk about today are a little bit newer, and they're also dorms that I did not live in. It's very typical of me that I spent my first 2 years at Fordham living in some of the most haunted dorms. That really seems right. So anyway, first up, we have a dorm called Loschert Hall, or when I was a student, it was known as Alumni Court North. There's another dorm that's called Alumni Court South. It was renamed in the late 2000s, and it was built in 1987, so it is a more recent building. So I found just a couple stories about weird things that happened in Loschert Hall. So I found a 2017 article in the Fordham Observer, which is the student newspaper at Fordham's Manhattan campus, Lincoln Center. And this article had some great accounts of some Fordham hauntings. And this article was written by Zoe Sinkhouse, I think is how you say this person's name. So anyway, the article recounts a story from a student named Tiffany Cato, class of 2007, whose friend lived in a single room in Alumni Court North, or Loschert, which also geographically, it's right next to Queens Court, which is a dorm that I've talked about a lot in past episodes. So basically, Her friend called her shaken and said that he had heard a knocking sound in the room, and Cato said that it was just his imagination and that he should go back to sleep. And I wanted to just read the next paragraph from the article, but Cato's friend couldn't go back to sleep. He calls me again later in the night, saying his bed shook and that he was going to sleep next to the guard that night. Just a side note from me, all of Fordham's dorms have guards from, I think it's 5 p.m. to, 7 or 8 a.m. So I guess this person was going to go down to the lobby and sit in a chair next to the guard, which is kind of strange, but okay. This person must have been really freaked out because that sounds really uncomfortable. So back to the article. The next day, Cato and her friend looked for clarity in one of the priests. The priest was like, "Oh, that's so-and-so. I guess he moved to your dorm. Come, let's go to your room." So then the priest grabbed some holy water, the Bible, and some candles. They headed over to the dorm. They lit the candles, and he opens the door and starts praying. And to read a little bit more from the article, there's a quote that wraps up this anecdote, which is, "All the freshmen around us must have been so freaked out, but whatever he did worked. Nothing ever happened again after that." So it sounds to me like a priest did a blessing in the room. Obviously not like an exorcism or anything, it sounds like just a pretty basic blessing, I assume. But I think it's really interesting because there's the part where the priest was like, "Oh, that's so-and-so." Okay, who is so-and-so? Why couldn't they have gotten the name of this supposed priest or entity that was haunting the room? I just love that there was like a priest on campus who was like, "Oh, well, that's just one of the usual ghosts. I'll just, say a prayer to ask him to leave, whatever." It reminds me a lot of one of the stories about Queen's Court, which is like, the most famous story about Queen's Court, which was that an RA was seeing that some mattresses were being propped up against the walls of a room before everyone had moved in for the school year. He kept fixing it, and they kept ending up propped up again. And a priest came to his door in the middle of the night and was basically like, "Oh, someone's been really praying for some help. I'm here to help." And he basically was like, "Oh, this entity usually stays down the hall, at the end of the hall, whatever. But I guess he got out." And so then he did something, some sort of blessing or exorcism or something to, I guess, bind this entity back to whatever place they were supposed to usually inhabit, whatever. And of course, it turns out that that priest was a ghost himself. In this story, the priest does seem to be a living priest, but it is interesting. Like, I just love the idea that there's priests at Fordham who are just like, I just have this image of them as like knowing the lore of the area, and they're like, "Oh, I know all the ghosts around here and where they're supposed to be and what their weird habits are." And, maybe the story's embellished or something. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility for someone to go to a priest and the priest to be like, "Yeah, sure, I'll bless your room." That seems totally reasonable to me. But it's just weird, "That's so-and-so, I guess he moved to your dorm." So that's a very intriguing tidbit there. And then the only other story I have about Loschert or Alumni Court North is a story that I found on the forum College Confidential. Obviously not the most reputable source. It's not a named person who related this story, but I did want to read from that. "I think it was North on Thanksgiving break. Everyone went home except for me and 2 other girls on my floor because we all had this one philosophy professor who assigned a 10 to 15 page paper first semester freshman year. Granted, my floor was deserted and I hung out with one of the girls all the time during that break. She was out getting McD's. I lived near the stairs, and I was in my room when I heard laughing and running down the hall. I ran to my door and looked out in the hallway to catch my friend or the other girl to see if they wanted to hang out, and no one was there. Also, no slamming of a door down the hall like they had run into their rooms. I just chalked it up to people in the building being really bored." So I guess this commenter later, reflecting upon the event, thought that this must have been some sort of paranormal experience. because, this was in a thread about hauntings on Fordham's campus at this college forum, which I remember going on that forum when I was in high school. It was like where you might ask, like, should I go to this school? What are the professors like? What's the student life like, etc. And there was just a random thread on that forum about ghost stories and paranormal encounters on Fordham's campus. So it's an interesting story. I wish I had more leads to follow to try to pick out, like, okay, who's this person or entity who might be haunting this dorm, and why are doors opening, closing, and have other people encountered that, etc. But I got nothing. And of course, there's all sorts of mundane explanations you could come up with for the bed shaking story. And of course, for hearing, someone running and slamming a door, maybe it was happening on another floor, etc. But still interesting. So the next dorm that I want to talk about is O'Hare Hall, which is a dorm that I think, at least when I was a student, it was really popular with sophomores and then upperclassmen who wanted singles. It's a newer building. It was built in 2000. And it was originally, I believe, called Millennium Hall, and then they renamed it to be called O'Hare after one of the Fordham University presidents in the past. So a website called theramrealm.com had a 2014 article that mentions the O'Hare hauntings, and it's really just one big story about hauntings at O'Hare. So I'll just read a bit from this website and then talk a little bit more about it, because I do have some thoughts on this one. Tragedy supposedly struck O'Hare when a worker fell from the roof back while it was being built. Though no legitimate source has verified this, still, rumors ran rampant when students started hearing weird sounds that reminded them of construction on the upper floors. One current resident who was familiar with the tale still lets it get to her and, quote, refuses to take the stairwells at night. She said she hears weird sounds late at night, and being afraid of ghosts, as is, she said she's, quote, let the tale get in her head and doesn't take any chances. So this article says that no legitimate source has verified the death of this construction worker, and that's not true, but I don't blame the author for not knowing, because I've only been able to find one source anywhere on the internet that mentions the construction worker by name, though it is a legitimate source. It's an article in the RAM from March 23rd, 2000. And, the RAM is the student newspaper at Fordham's Rose Hill or Bronx campus. So before I get to that, it's also worth mentioning that the Fordham Library website on their page about hauntings on Fordham's campus, because the university does acknowledge the hauntings and the library has a whole page about it. Anyway, the website mentions him, though not by name, in their write-up of the haunting, which I just wanted to read real quick. Though one of the newer dorms on campus, built in 2000, O'Hare has a ghost of its own. One of the construction workers had a heart attack while working on the roof and fell tragically to his death. Students have reported the sound of hammering in the walls as if the spirit of the man is still trying to finish the job. So, I have some thoughts on this haunting. First off, the most obvious thing to point out is there are, of course, many reasons why, even in a new building, you might hear sounds, banging sounds, construction site type sounds. It's a college campus. People are doing all kinds of weird things. I mean, even in the building I live in Queens, I just had to spend like an hour waiting to record because someone was banging and moving stuff around, etc. And I couldn't record with it being that loud. So it's normal in apartment living or dorm living for there to be loud noises and unexplainable noises where you're like, I don't know what could make that noise. And it's like, yeah, you don't know, but like maybe someone's just like moving a chair or something, or they like jumped down from a step ladder or something. It's kind of hard to say what you're hearing when you're hearing it at a distance. And I'm not trying to like delegitimize any experiences that people may have had in O'Hare if they think they were legitimate paranormal experiences. I just haven't read anything that feels like anything more than someone just being like, ooh, isn't it creepy that someone tragically died here? There must be a ghost because of that. And I guess maybe, but I just don't find, I find this haunting really frustrating and upsetting because, or, stories of this haunting. Because one, I don't see any evidence that, to me, makes it appear that there's a legitimate haunting occurring here. But this is a really sad story about someone dying not that long ago. So the year 2000, so 22 years ago, this man died. And I don't know, it just doesn't feel super respectful to me for someone who, died not that long ago. I assume his family still lives in the area. I don't know. I think I would feel maybe a little bit weird if I had a close family member who died and then college kids were like telling scary stories about this person. It doesn't sit well with me at all, and I don't feel good about this. So I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about who this person was who died. Like I said, I could only find this one article from the RAM from March 2000, but I just wanted to put a little bit of like a face and name to this urban legend because it's a sad story. The ghost story about O'Hare gets repeated ad nauseum. It's kind of turned into an urban legend, but no one talks about the man who died and what his story was. So I just wanted to share some details that I learned from this article about who this person was. So here's what happened. A 42-year-old man named Kenneth B Woodruff Jr. from Walsh Hall, New York, was on the scaffolding between the 4th and 5th floors near where the north and west wings of the building connect. He fell face down on a pile of rocks on Friday, March 20th, 2000. When the student EMS service and fire department arrived, they pronounced Woodruff dead. Shortly after his death, a Jesuit named Joseph Curry said a prayer and recited Psalm 23. That's the psalm that in the King James version of the Bible starts, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," etc. So after Father Curry said the prayer and recited the psalm, one of Woodruff's co-workers said the Our Father, and another co-worker said the Serenity Prayer. And there's just something so horrific to me about the idea that you're just like at work one day doing your job and your coworker dies. And so you have to like say some prayers for your coworker who just died. It's just awful. So that afternoon, Fordham's head of security, John Carroll, Father Curry, and one of Woodruff's coworkers, Sean Callan, went to the Woodruff family's home. So Woodruff was married and he had kids. So he left behind his wife, Patricia, and a 20-year-old son, a 14-year-old son, and a daughter who had just turned 12. Woodruff's hobbies included fishing and acting in local plays. He was involved with the local Gilbert and Sullivan Theater Society, and he was in plays like Kismet, Sweeney Todd, The Most Happy Fella, and other productions. When they had his funeral, 250 people attended. And at the time of this article, which, was printed almost 2 weeks after Woodruff's death, at the time of the article, it sounds like there had been discussion of potentially memorializing Woodruff in some way. The priest, Father Curry, suggested naming the wing of the building that Woodruff had been working on after him. As far as I'm aware, I don't believe that happened. Though, like I said, I never lived in O'Hare. I'm a lot less familiar with that building. But I read about O'Hare on Fordham's website, and I couldn't find any mention of him on that page or on a search of fordham.edu. And I kind of think that his name wouldn't be so forgotten, because I could only find his name in this one article, and maybe his name would show up in some of the urban legends and stuff if they actually had named the wing after him. If they didn't name the wing after him, which I assume they didn't, I think that is kind of screwed up. No one needed to die during the construction of a building. And it's just really sad and awful. So, like I said, when I searched the Rams archives, I couldn't find any other article mentioning Kenneth Woodruff by name. I also Googled his name. And, with Fordham as another search term, I couldn't find any information about him aside from what I found in this one article. So, this has become an urban legend, but yes, someone really did die 22 years ago. It's a really, really sad story to think about him, dying, and he had a family and kids, etc. And I like I said, it just really sits poorly with me that he's become this urban legend. And maybe it's a little bit close-minded to say something like, ghost stories about recent deaths are in bad taste, because of course it's possible that someone may have experienced real phenomena that could have been attributed to the spirit of someone who's recently deceased, but it doesn't seem like that's the case. Like, it sounds like it's just like they being like the collective memory of the student body. Students remembered that someone died and then kind of concocted this urban legend, because that's how urban legends are formed, right? Like, they're kind of formed around recent events or anxieties, etc. And it's gotten to the point where people are like, supposedly a construction worker died. Like, it's already gained that level of urban legend status where it's, it's not just that the possibility of a haunting is in question, the possibility of this death is in question in the urban legend. So anyway, I don't think that anyone who's repeating this urban legend is like a bad person or is uncaring. Like, it is an urban legend. I did have to dig pretty deep to find out the real stories about Kenneth Woodruff and, to find some information about him. I found it in the Rams archives, but that's not super, super easily searchable. So I don't think there's malice here. I just think that it's kind of insensitive to build ghost stories around a recent death like this, unless you really have legitimately experienced something that you think is paranormal. But otherwise, it's a college campus, things are loud. Just because someone died somewhere doesn't mean that they're still there in spirit. And just from a logical standpoint, I do have to question why exactly a construction worker would want to hang out around the work site. Like, if I died, I can tell you right now, my ghost would not be haunting the office or, whatever my workplace might be. I don't want to be at work when I'm alive. I certainly wouldn't want to be working in death. So, I think it would be a really different thing if someone was like, I don't know, like an artisan stone worker and creating some kind of sculpture or something. But it's like, unless you have a job where you're really pouring your heart and soul into it, like some sort of artist or something, I just imagine that most people would want to spend as little amount of time at work as they could. And certainly if they were dead, they would not want to hang out around their place of work. And maybe it's silly of me to even try to drill down and think about this from this logical standpoint, because it is just an urban legend. But I don't know. It just doesn't seem right to me. So anyway, that's the story of Kenneth Woodruff. It was a really tragic event. His death was very tragic. And it's not great that it has become fodder for urban legend. That's what I've got to say about that one. So that's O'Hare Hall. Next, let's talk about Martyrs Court. So Martyrs Court, when I was in school, was either the second least desirable dorm on campus or the least desirable dorm on campus, depending on who you asked. I think that Martyrs Court and Hughes Hall, which I talked about on a previous episode, were the two bottom of the barrel, least desirable, most hated dorms. Martyrs Court was built in 1950 to 51. It's not terrible looking. Like, I think it fits in okay with the architecture on campus. Definitely fits in better than some of the newer buildings on campus. It has 3 wings, each of whom are named after a martyr, and I use that term with huge quotation marks. Of course, the Catholic Church considers these folks martyrs. I have my own opinions about that, and if you want to hear more about what I think about these particular martyrs, you can check out the episodes that I did on Calvary Cemetery. I think the one where I talk about Archbishop John Hughes, who founded Fordham and also consecrated Calvary Cemetery when it opened. If you listen to that episode, I talk in some detail about these martyrs who, long story short, were colonizers. I don't think they were good people. And I think it's screwed up that there's a dorm named after them. But I remember from speaking to alumni and people whose parents went to Fordham, Martyrs Court wasn't always such a terrible dorm. Back in, I think, like the 70s, it used to be arranged into, I think, like houses almost. And I think it was like more suite style living. And I think it was almost like there were little apartments in there, something like that. But now it is a pretty traditional dorm with, a bathroom down the hall, doubles and triples. I remember when I was in school, there were a ton of forced triples. And I'm trying to remember, I think that Martyrs at the time that I was at Fordham, I think it was mostly a sophomore dorm, but I can't remember 100% for sure. So the stories of hauntings at Martyr really baffle me because they seem to be centered around the ghosts of children. And I have not, for the life of me, been able to figure out why there would be children in this dorm. Like, it's not that old. It's from the 1950s. As far as I can tell, it was always used as a dorm. It's not like something like Hughes Hall or Queen's Court, where at different times it was used as a prep school. And, at different times prep school students might have lived there. So there was reason for a child's ghost to potentially haunt it. I don't know what's going on with Martyrs Court. If I had to give a guess, I would say, well, people are creeped out by little children because of horror movies in which there's like evil children. So maybe if people are experiencing things that are paranormal, they're like overlaying their ideas of what's creepy or what's in horror movies onto whatever they're seeing. It's like maybe the phenomena they're encountering is almost being like skinned by what they expect to see. And when I say skinned, I don't mean the skin is taken off. I mean like skinned as in there's like a screen overlaid on something else. That theory could be completely wrong, but I just don't understand why people would see the ghosts of children. So anyway, supposedly the ghost of a little girl haunts Martyrs. There are stories of students pulling back a shower curtain in the bathroom to find a little blonde girl standing in the shower staring straight ahead. Some people have claimed to hear children's laughter echoing from the walls. And like I said, in the past I found this not super credible. Think, people are preoccupied by horror movies with creepy kids. But when I was doing research for this, I did find a theory that seemed plausible to me and could maybe explain why the place could be haunted by children. So there's a book called The Big Book of New York City Ghost Stories by Sherry Farnsworth. That's Sherry spelled Cheri. It was published in 2019, and just a side note before I read this excerpt, I am really impressed with this book. It was really helpful to me in my research about Fordham, and it's kind of rare to see like a big ghost story compilation book about somewhere as vast as New York, and to see that the person did really deep research and tried to think about theories about why something could be haunted, and, in some cases found information that I wasn't able to find. And I've spent a very long time researching this series. So I just want to pause and strongly recommend that you pick up this book, The Big Book of New York Ghost Stories by Sherry Farnsworth. If you're interested in New York hauntings at all, which I assume you are since you're listening to this, because she does some really interesting research, and I think this book is really well done. And I haven't read it cover to cover yet. I've mostly just read it, as I've been doing research on different topics. But I'm excited to one of these days sit down and read all of it, because it's a really cool book, and she's done really great research. So anyway, to read a bit from the book. Who the child was is anyone's guess. She was too young to be a former university student, but she might be a deceased descendant of the Corsa family. The subtitle of a New York Times article dated June 9th, 1899 said a, quote, descendant of Andrew Corsa claims some of the property on which St. John's, Fordham, stands. According to the article, a Mrs. Davenport Bowlesbridge claimed that her first husband, John H. Corsa, the grandnephew of Andrew Corsa, had refused to sign a release for a man who had purchased property from Andrew's widow, Anne. Because of financial difficulties, she was seeking the property on behalf of her children, who, she said, were, quote, in sore need of any property which might be rightfully theirs. Do their children, the direct descendants of Andrew Corsa, now inhabit the Fordham grounds. So I've mentioned the Corsa family before. The Corsa family burial ground was found when Queen's Court was being constructed. As they were, digging for the foundations of the building, they found all these skeletons. And, it sounds like they just reburied the skeletons next to Queen's Court. But I think this is a pretty plausible explanation. It's better than anything I had been able to think of over the years. And, of course, it's worth noting that Fordham stands on stolen land, as does everything in New York City. And, America in general. I believe that the land that Fordham's on now is the land of the Lenni Lenape and the Wappinger peoples. So it is their land, not the Corsa family's land. And, not the Jesuits or the university's land. But the semantics of the article aside, I do think that it is a good potential explanation, if this family believed that this land was theirs, and if the children of this family believed that the land was theirs, maybe they could have done some haunting to get back at the people who they believed stole their land. So I mentioned that I found a couple accounts of hauntings in Martyrs Court that people actually went on the record about. So I found these in the Ram in an article called The Haunted History of Fordham School Spirits from October 25th, 2017, and that was written by Julia Boren. So, to read from that. Martyrs is known to have a little girl ghost. This blonde spirit has been seen in the bathrooms and is said to like to lurk behind shower curtains. Bella Wood, Fordham College at Rose Hill 2020, had a dorm room freshman year that was located directly next door to the communal bathrooms. Our bedroom door would open and close on its own on several occasions, she said. Monica Fufal, Fordham College at Rose Hill 18, had an even eerier Martyrs experience her freshman year. What happened was, I woke up one morning around Halloween with sleep paralysis and I couldn't move. I tried yelling my roommate's name, but I felt something like hands choking me. Above me was this floating, translucent figure-like girl with long hair that didn't have a face, but that was still looking at me. When she finally disappeared, I got this really calming feeling, like nothing had happened, but I was confused because I was sweating and shaking. I got really freaked out and couldn't sleep the next few nights, but got over it when our floor had our infamous bathroom blessing a few days later, she said. So there's a lot to unpack there. First off, I have never heard of this apparently infamous bathroom blessing. It sounds interesting. It's not elaborated anywhere else. I searched and looked to see if I could find anything else about the bathroom blessing, and I could not. But I really have some questions there, because that ties in to the whole thing that I was talking about with Alumni Court North, or Loschert, where, there was an instance of a priest coming to bless a room, and, this priest seemed to know what entity was causing the problem. And this kind of it feeds into that same narrative that potentially maybe these blessings happen with some sort of frequency. It just seems wild to me, but this is a university that acknowledges its own hauntings, and it's also, the Catholic Church is an organization that still does exorcisms and acknowledges the existence of ghosts and demons, etc., and, does blessings as well. I think I've probably mentioned this in a past episode, but exorcisms are done extremely rarely. So, I would assume that most instances where a priest would get involved, it would just be a blessing. You have to get, I think, special permission for an exorcism. It's a whole thing. But anyway, I find that very interesting. I wish there's more information about the bathroom blessing. I also found the sleep paralysis thing interesting. It reminded me a bit of some of the stories about Finley Hall, which I talked about in the last 2 episodes. This idea of, someone choking you, etc. I hadn't really seen that reported about Martyrs Court previously. And just a side note about sleep paralysis, I'm actually reading a really interesting book right now called Dark Folklore by Mark Norman and Tracy Norman. And it was published just a few months ago in October 2021, so it's a pretty new book. I'm really enjoying it. But the whole first chapter is about sleep paralysis and hags and that sort of thing. And one thing that the book was saying is that, there's this idea that potentially sleep paralysis is when, if I'm remembering this correctly, when you wake up during your REM cycle of sleep and, you can't move because I guess in that cycle you can't really move. And I guess there's a theory that people's brains, like their minds, are supplying what they see in instances of sleep paralysis. So like the traditional thing would be like a hag potentially like sitting on your chest and like choking you. Like there's a lot of stuff about like having your breath taken or being choked, etc. There's of course stories of shadow people, and as aliens and UFOs have become more of a thing, there's more sleep paralysis episodes tied to UFO phenomena. And I think there's this idea that like maybe it's just your brain supplying that. But of course, I can't hear that without thinking, well, maybe your brain's supplying it because your brain is perceiving something that you can't usually perceive in this other state that you're not usually awake during, etc., etc. So, at any rate, I mention this just because the book has a really interesting chapter about sleep paralysis. If you're interested in knowing a bit more about sleep paralysis and its history and different theories about it, etc. But very interesting. And of course, the other thing in the article about the person's door to their bedroom opening and closing on its own, that can really go either way, I think. Like, that building is from the 50s, but since they restructured how it works, I wouldn't be surprised if all those doors were replaced as recently as the 70s or 80s. So it's not like those doors are that old, but I do know with old doors sometimes, like, there can be issues with them coming open. And that's actually something I've experienced in my own apartment that I live in now, which is about 100 years old. And I do have an issue with doors opening and closing in my apartment on their own. And there's one door where I know there's just a problem with the latch. Or I can't remember what that thing is called, but you turn the knob and there's the little piece that retracts when you turn the knob so you can open the door. And that one's just faulty. It's an old door. All the doors in my apartment are old. Like, I think they're all original to the apartment. But there's 2 other doors in my apartment that do open and close on their own. They do it whether or not the windows are open. They sometimes will go, weeks without really opening or closing. And then there'll be a flurry of openings and closings. But those doors, when they're closed, they're like really closed. You can pull on them, you can try to open them, and they will not open unless you turn that knob. So all of this to say, old doors are unreliable and they can just come open on their own. But also, there can be something else potentially afoot. And I think for me, in my current apartment, what's been key to us saying, like, okay, we think there's something paranormal that's tied to the doors, or where the doors opening and closing on their own, the ones that we know close securely, we think that's tied to paranormal phenomena. The reason why we think that is because there's other paranormal phenomena that tends to happen around the same time, and there's like multiple other things going on in the apartment. So in the case of Martyrs, I feel like one person having their dorm room door open, yeah, the door's not that old, so that's kind of weird. And also a lot of, it's probably locked most of the time. So for an unlocked door to open on its own, that's less weird. But if the door is locked, that's really weird. And of course, if the door only opens when you talk about certain things, or if there's other phenomena happening at the same time, then that's really interesting. And we just don't have enough information in this article to make a call either way. But I wanted to make sure to kind of debunk it, but also talk through some of the reasons why maybe it could potentially be tied to paranormal phenomena. We just can't say anything from reading this article, really. But it is interesting. And this other student's sleep paralysis episodes are very interesting, of course. So I've got a few more stories about Martyrs Court. So I found this story about Martyrs Court on that website, College Confidential. I think this had been reposted from elsewhere, but I'm not 100% sure where it came from. So I just wanted to read from this. Residents have reported seeing a young blonde-haired girl standing in the shower behind the curtain staring straight ahead. The dean's response when they, the students, wanted to move was, "It's March. This sort of thing happens all the time, and worse, so just try to turn the other cheek." They also report seeing a man walking by their rooms in the direction of a wall at the end of the hall. When they would go out to see who it was, he'd be gone, and they would also hear children's laughter in the walls of their apartment. So the man walking through walls is interesting. I wasn't seeing that a bunch of other places. The thing about the dean saying that, the student should just kind of ignore it and turn the other cheek, I actually find that sentence, or a couple sentences, extremely believable. I definitely could imagine a dean at Fordham, a student life, related dean, quoting scripture as an excuse to not let students move out of a not great living situation. And I mean, there's a couple ways to interpret the phrase, "this sort of thing happens all the time." The dean could have been talking about paranormal stuff, but also could have just been talking about bad living conditions on campus. And if you want to know more about that, you can check out my episode about Hughes Hall, where I talked about what living conditions were like there when I lived there. And you can also listen to one of the Finley Hall episodes. I talked about historically some maintenance issues that caused students distress in the past at Fordham that the administration did not address. So anyway, it's hearsay, it's urban legend, it's not attributed, but just that idea that someone went to the dean, asked to be moved, and got that response, that to me, I read that, I'm like, oh yeah, this definitely sounds like a true story. Just that detail felt really real to me, but who knows, really. So I also found another person commenting on that thread in College Confidential, on that forum, who shared their own story about Martyrs. So to read from that, I'm not sure if this is the same ghost, but I did see a blonde girl sitting on the toilet in the toilet stalls in Martyrs. When I went back and checked, there was no one there. Also, side note, this is me. I do think it would be weird for a student to be sitting on the toilet with the stall door open. So, and the door had to be open if this person knew that the girl sitting there was blonde. She had to have seen, like, her face. So I do think that's a little bit weird, and I don't think it's just like, oh yeah, a student just saw someone using the restroom and made some assumptions. I don't know, that does seem weird to me. And so to continue reading, a couple weeks back, I also saw someone sitting in one of the lounges, but there wasn't anyone there when I turned around. Of course, it might be my mind playing tricks on me, but I think it's much cooler to say that I saw ghosts rather than I was imagining things. So that's interesting too, the idea of this person disappearing in a lounge. And of course, it could have just been a student who got up and walked away. But I don't know. There's a lot of other stories about hauntings in the building, and it does seem weird that someone could be... Like, I'm not very familiar with the lounges in Martyrs, but I think they're pretty small. So it seems weird that someone could, like, leave a lounge without someone else in that same vicinity noticing the person leave, but who knows? The website unexplainable.net also had a little snippet about Martyrs Court, and I take these aggregator type websites with like a huge grain of salt, but it mentions, the little girl ghost in the shower. And then also, to read a bit from it, another ghost is that of a man who has been reported to walk by the rooms of residents, heading towards a wall located at the end of the hall. When attempting to investigate his identity, he has vanished before curious students had a chance. And it mentions the laughter of children as well. So, I don't know. Maybe there's something there with the disappearing, man disappearing through walls. Maybe not. Definitely interesting, though. So then, next up, we have Walsh Hall, or as it was formerly known, 555. So this is the dorm right next to Finley Hall. It was built in the 70s, I believe. I didn't write it down, but I'm pretty sure it's from the 70s. It is apartment-style living for upperclassmen. When I was a student, it was mostly juniors and seniors who live there. And there's not a lot of paranormal experiences that I found in Walsh. So I was actually really excited and surprised to find one. So in the November 7th, 2002 issue of the RAM, a student named Alicia Grace Mason recounts some of her paranormal experiences while she was living in Walsh 605. So on the first week of school, she and her roommate set their clocks together, and a week later, her roommate's clock was 15 minutes ahead of hers. The roommate synced up their clocks again, and then Mason's clock was 15 minutes ahead. So just, weird electrical issue. She also used to hear the shower running at night, and their doors would slowly open and then slam shut. Her roommate verified the sounds as well. I talked a lot about doors already. This is a newer building, and I think that it has central air. It was built in the 70s, so it must have had central air. So as soon as something has central air, I start to get a little bit more suspicious about stories about doors opening and closing. I think it's a very different thing to be in a building with no airflow and, no air on, the windows closed, etc., and have doors opening and closing versus like being in a building where the air can kick on. But still, maybe there's something there. I think the clock thing is weird because it's weird that one of their clocks got out of sync and then the other one of their clocks got out of sync. And also interesting that was the first week of school. A lot of the stories that I've seen, like some of the Queen's Court stories, seem to occur early on in the semester. And there was a student who was quoted in an article that I read that was basically like talking about the ghosts kind of just saying hello, checking people out, etc. And the thing with the shower running at night, I think that's really interesting. I guess it's possible that maybe they could hear a neighbor showering and like hear it through their apartment and assume that's their shower. But I think they'd probably be somewhat used to that. I think they'd probably be able to distinguish between a neighbor's shower and their own, but maybe not. And then the other thing that happened was one of her suite mates, because it was apartment style living, so a couple people per room, clustered into an apartment with a shared kitchen and living room. I think that typically like 6 people would live in each apartment, something like that, 2 per room. So they were like 3-bedroom apartments, something like that. So one of her suite mates had a small table fan, which would turn on and off by itself. They checked the plug and the switch and everything seemed normal, but it seemed to just have these weird issues. And that's another one where it's like, taken in isolation, I would say, it's just a faulty fan. But kind of combined with everything else, that is a little strange, I guess. The student also talked about some of the other stories that she had heard, like a friend of hers who was at Rodrigues, which was the student-run coffee shop. Rodrigues is also known as Alumni House, and it's like this little tiny building that's over by Queen's Court. I think it was closed for renovation for at least some of the time that I was in college, so I didn't go there very often, but I do remember the couple times I went inside, it had a sort of narrow catwalk ledge thing around its interior, and this student says that a friend of hers was at Rodrigues and heard someone walking above him, but when he looked, no one was there. And that's the only ghost story I'd heard about Rodrigues, so I figured I'd mention it here. But side note, there's kind of an interesting history behind Rodrigues. It is landmarked, for one thing. New York City Landmarks describes it as a, quote, small Greek revival house, and it says that its original purpose was unclear, but it might have been the home of William Rodrigue, who was Archbishop John Hughes' brother-in-law, and Hughes founded Fordham. Rodrigue was an architect who was involved with designing the university church and St. John's Hall, the oldest wing of Queen's Court, and he was also a math and engineering professor at the school. Rodrigue may have designed the building for his family to live in while he worked on the church and St. John's Hall, but New York City Landmarks points out that the style is more like the Rose Hill Mansion than the Gothic revival structures that Rodrigue is responsible for. The date 1840 appears on a stone beneath the attic window, so that predates the school's founding, but that is after John Hughes purchased the land or whatever. And then there's this little bit of the Landmarks Commission report that I really liked, so I just wanted to read. In any event, the house soon became the parish house and the office of the pastor of St. John's Church, and later served as a college infirmary, earning the nickname the Pillbox. Offices of the Fordham Monthly and the Ram were subsequently housed in the building, and for a time, a bakery in the basement produced a campus specialty, Fordham buns. Prior to being occupied by the housing office, the building contained alumni offices. This report was from the 70s, I think, so I guess in the 70s it was the housing office. But I just loved the detail about there being a bakery in the basement that produced this famous Fordham bun, and I really wish it described what that was. For whatever reason, I'm just picturing a hot cross bun, but that's probably not actually what it was. But I just find it delightful. But at any rate, Alumni House or Rodrigues does have a long history, and so, if it was haunted, I wouldn't be super surprised. There's a lot of history to draw from if you're trying to explain what sorts of phenomena might be happening there, etc. So I've just got one more building that I want to talk about. For this episode, I guess it's really 2, but the buildings are interconnected. I want to talk about Loyola Hall and Faber Hall, which are these 2 interconnected buildings that when I was in school, students did not live in, but there are some students living in those buildings now. So Loyola was built, I believe, in 1928, and Faber was built in 1959. When I was a student, Loyola was just a Jesuit residence, and Faber was a departmental office building. There might have been some classrooms there too, but I'm not sure. Now, about 125 freshmen live in Loyola, and there are 2 floors of Faber where freshmen and transfer students live. Faber was renovated for students to live there in 2016, and I'm not totally sure when the switch to having students live in Loyola happened, but it was sometime in the last decade, which means there's been just less time for ghost stories to accumulate online and in the RAM, etc. about these buildings. Just less time for urban legends because students didn't spend that much time in these buildings until the last decade or so. However, I do think that ghost stories are going to start circulating about these buildings now that students are living there. And That's because 1, Fordham's real haunted, and 2, because Faber Hall is built on top of the former location of the university's cemetery. So I mentioned this in a previous episode, but according to a RAM article from October 21st, 1999, at one point, the university cemetery was where Faber Hall is now. The cemetery was originally where the botanical gardens are now, and then the bodies were disinterred and moved from there to where Faber is now. And then when they built Faber Hall in the 50s, they moved the bodies to the current location of the cemetery. I think I read this in an earlier episode, but to refresh all of our memories, the cemetery, which dates back to 1847, has not been significantly changed since 1959, when bodies were moved due to the construction of Faber Hall. So Fordham is a place where it's pretty common for bodies to be moved because of the construction of buildings, whether it be Queen's Court or Faber Hall. So of course that kind of thing is gonna create an atmosphere for urban legends and ghost stories to start to circulate. Although when I was a student, I don't think it was widely known that the cemetery was moved multiple times. At least when I was a student, I thought it was only moved the one time. So I did find one story about a possible haunting in Loyola Hall. So this is from a 2016 article called Fordham University is Straight Out of a Horror Movie, published on the odysseyonline.com. And the person who wrote the article lived in Loyola, and here's what she had to say about it. My home for the last year, and Father Joseph McShane's former room, which, this is me, side note, Father McShane is the, current / about to be former president of the university. So very well known and influential figure there. At any rate. And Father McShane's former room, Loyola 415, is one of the lesser known haunted rooms on campus. Living there from 1992 to 1996, Father McShane has noted the room as the, quote, best room on campus, at least in his opinion. However, even with the best view on campus, 415 is not without recurrent spooky moments. Father McShane notes, one oddity of the room, I was awakened every morning at around 5 when the steam heat started up and the pipes banged to beat the band. This occurrence, as well as a few others, have occurred during my time in the room. Late at night, construction work can be heard from the room and not any other. My roommates and I have also witnessed the closet opening on its own many a time. While it was pretty spooky, we may just be chickens. So, you can probably guess what I'm about to say about the stories of this haunting. I think it's interesting. However, you can perhaps hear behind me, the radiator just got kind of loud. It's not banging, it's just making a gurgling noise. But as I've mentioned many times, and as you've probably heard in the background of this episode, radiators in old buildings in New York City, especially ones that were built in the 1920s, like the one I'm in right now, are loud. That's just how it is. They're just loud. And I think a lot of the time the heat starts up in the morning, so it's warm for when you wake up and get out of bed. So it's not a paranormal thing that the steam radiator turned on and started making noise. That just means you have heat, and that's great. But it doesn't mean you have a ghost. I think the construction noise thing is interesting. I think that I would dismiss that and just be like, it's probably just like students being loud. But I think that the fact that other people could not hear the noises is very interesting because it parallels my experience in Finley Hall, where I was hearing noises. My roommate and I could hear noises in our room. We asked around and people could not hear the noises elsewhere. So I actually think that's really interesting. It's interesting that we experienced similar phenomena there, even though this student was hearing construction noise that no one else could hear, and my roommate and I were hearing screaming / gibbering sort of sounds. Still strange in both cases. And, the closet door opening on its own, same thing I've already said about doors in this episode. It could mean something, it could mean nothing. Old closet doors have a tendency to open on their own. But of course, if it's accompanied by other phenomena, yeah, maybe it does mean something. And of course, the stuff I'm saying and like the debunkings and theorizing that I'm doing about these folks' experiences, I just am reading things in articles and then based on the very limited information I have, trying to analyze them. Of course, there could be more to any of these stories, and I'm not trying to say anything to invalidate anyone's experiences or beliefs about what happened to them. But, a lot of the time there is a little bit of a explanation for what's happening that could be mundane, but it doesn't mean that it's definitely not paranormal, So that's what I've got for this episode. Next episode, I'm going to talk about some weird buildings on campus that are haunted, of course. Same deal. It's kind of incredible how many hauntings there are on Fordham's campus. I've been mapping them out on a Google map that I'll probably share at some point. And it's just wild to see all the different urban legends, weird history, former cemetery locations, etc. on the map. Because it's one thing, obviously I'll probably have ended up with 10 hours of audio or something just about Fordham hauntings. So of course there's a lot, but it's easy when I look at that to say to myself, oh, but I was talking and analyzing things, etc. But when you really see it plotted out on a map, that's when at least for me, I was like, man, Fordham really does have a lot of highly concentrated ghost stories. So, I don't know. I've been really having fun working on this series, and I hope that it has been enjoyable to listen to. And I think I have 3 more episodes planned for the Fordham series. So, more than halfway through, but it's not quite over yet. So anyway, look out for the next episode the week after next. In the meantime, you can check out buriedsecretspodcast.com for the show notes and all of my sources. You can check out my Instagram at buriedsecretspodcast. I have been posting, some pictures from Fordham, both when I attended and also historical photos. If you liked this podcast, please tell your friends about it. Please rate and review it wherever you're listening to it. That really helps other people find out about the podcast. And thanks so much for listening.